This episode is sponsored by Honeybadger. Are you looking to enhance clarity in production without a PhD in observability? Try Honeybadger Insights. Honeybadger Insights is built around structured events and Honeybadger's new query language BadgerQL, which allows you to analyze data, create metrics, and design custom dashboards. All of this is available for free with Honeybadger's monitoring suite, which includes error tracking, uptime monitoring, and more. Explore your data in new ways with BadgerQL. It's pretty cool and simple. So give it a try today at honeybadger.io. That's honeybadger.io. In this episode, we're going to have a look where we're going to import in a CSV file, and that CSV file is going to have a lot of records. So I'll just drag it in here and we'll import it. And there's going to be a lot of things happening within the CSV. So I'll open up the CSV and we'll have a look at what we have in here. We have a list of countries and then we have a list of the corresponding flags. And the flags are just URLs. So there's a lot of things that we have to take into consideration when doing this. And it's going to be a little bit tricky because for each one of the rows in the CSV, we're then going to process those in a separate background job. But we're going to have a main background job that's going to handle the initial queuing of all of them. And so where that becomes complicated is when we go to import in our CSV file, that's being uploaded to our web server. And if your production infrastructure has a separation of the web servers and background workers, so if you're running on Heroku, or have separate virtual machines or have them Dockerized, then they may not have access to these same file uploads. And that's especially true if you have scaled horizontally. So that can be a bit tricky, and we're going to look at a few different little tricks that we can do to handle those situations. And so in a fresh Rails 7 application, we're going to start with a Rails active_storage :install to install active storage, and it's just going to copy over a migration file. I'm then going to generate a scaffold, and I'm going to call this the countries, and we'll have the name of the country, and then we're also going to have a flag. But the flag, we do want to use the attachment, which won't actually create an attribute on our countries table, but it'll set up in the Rails application the flag attribute to be an active storage attachment. And so once we do that, we can run Rails db:/migrate to migrate the database. And essentially what that has done, if we look at the country in the form, you'll see that we have a file field for the flag, and in the model for the country, it has one attached for the flag. It also went ahead and set up the controller. Down in the country params, it's permitting the name and the flag. So it set all of that up for us. The one thing that we will need to do, because we are going to be using some variants or image representations, so basically we're going to be resizing them, is we do need to come into our gem file and we do need to uncomment the image processing gem. Once we do that, we can run bundle to install that gem. And make sure you restart your Rails application after running bundle. And so next I want to go into the routes.rb file, and you'll see that we have our resources for the countries, but I also want to have something for the imports. So we'll have a resource for our imports, and we really only need a couple of different actions. So we'll pass in the only, and we want the new and also the create. So if we were to run the Rails routes-g import, we'll see what this looks like. We have a new imports path, which is a get request to the /imports/new, and that takes us to an imports controller and the new action. And similar for the post, we have the imports path, and that's going to take us to the imports controller and the create action. And I don't like this, simply because if I were to look at this, whether in the routes or in the controllers, then I'm just going to have this imports controller and it doesn't mean anything to me. Without going into that file, I have no context of what it's actually doing. So instead, I want to create a namespace around it. So I have a namespace for the countries. We'll create a block and we'll just put this resource imports within there. So now, if I were to do the Rails routes, grepping the import, you'll see that now it is the new countries imports path and the country imports path for posting, and it's going to be a different URI, but now it's going to be namespace under the countries folder, and we then have the imports controller. So we can actually go ahead and generate this controller with a Rails generate controller, and we'll generate it with the countries/imports. And that'll create the imports controller under the countries folder, and it will create that countries folder if it didn't exist, and it also namespaces it in our views. So within this imports controller, we're going to have a few different actions. We'll have our new action, and then we'll also have the create action. For now, the new action, we don't need anything in here. For the create action, that's where things are going to get a little bit tricky, but we'll come to that in just a moment. Let's first go down to our views, and under the countries folder, in the imports folder, we'll have a new .html.erb. Within here, we could just have a form with, and we don't have a model that we can pass in here, but we can pass in a URL, and that's going to be to the countries imports path. And that's going to take us to the post or the create action of that imports controller. We'll create a block for our form, and then I'll create a div with a class, and we'll just use a margin bottom of 3 because this is a Bootstrap application, but that's not really important in this case. And we'll have a label for our file, and we'll give it a class of the form-label, and then we'll have a file field for our file, and that's going to be a class of the form-control. Finally, we have a submit button. We'll just call it the import, and we'll give this some styling as well. We'll just make it a button and a button-primary. So that takes care of the view, but we also need a link to this. So we'll put this in our welcome index controller. This is simply just going to be a link to our import countries, and that's going to take us to the new _countries_imports_path. So at this point, our landing page, we had this link to import in the countries. We click on that, that'll take us to the new action of our imports controller, and it'll render the form. We can then select a file, click import, and that'll take us to the create action. And that's where things are going to get a little bit complicated. So we can take our file and we can get it with the params file because that's the name that we put in our form on the new page. But now we had to figure out what we are going to do with this file because we want to process this in a background job. But on the web server where it has received the file, it's not going to have the ability to transfer that file over to the background job. And depending on the size of that file, it's not something that you really want to pass as an argument. This file doesn't need to stick around forever, but I do need it long enough to get picked up within a few seconds by the background processor. And I also don't want to take the approach where I create a whole nother table that's then going to store that file or be a temporary record that's going to house it until it gets picked up at the background job, because that just adds a lot of complexity. But instead, what I want to do is just simply use what we already have configured, and that is the active storage. So we can make a blob record, and this blob record we can access through the active storage ::blob, and then we can call the create _ and upload with the bang, and we can pass in a few different parameters. The IO, we can pass in that file. The file name, we can pass in the file.original_file name, and then we can specify the content type, and that is going to be from our file, the content_type. And so that's actually then going to upload the file, and then we can access it. So if we go to create a background job, so we can do that with a Rails generate job. I'm going to call this the countries/import job. That's going to namespace it under the jobs, countries, import job. We can then reference to this. So we can call the countries : import job, and we want to perform _later, and we need to pass something in here. So we can pass in our blob and the signed _ID. And so that way, with that signed ID within the background job, we can then take in that parameter, look up that blob, and download and process the file. Once we're done, we can just redirect to, and we can go back to our countries path with a notice that the countries are being imported. And so that's really the bulk of what we have to do on the front end. Now we need to handle this on the back end. So if we come under the jobs, countries, and in the import job, instead of passing in the argument, we want to have our blob signed ID. We can call this whatever we want, but I do try to keep it somewhat consistent with what we're passing in. So we can look up this blob with the blob is equal to the active storage : blob, and we can find signed. We can just pass in that blob signed ID, and now we basically have our blob to work with. If we call the blob.download, that's going to download it off of active storage, and we can create a block with the data. And so there is probably some opportunities for optimization here, because when we are downloading it and then iterating over each one of the records, that could create a situation where a very large spreadsheet is going to then have to be loaded into memory, and it could take quite a bit. So basically what I want to do is to make this process happen as fast as possible. So if it did have to spike up the memory, it's going to be for just a very short amount of time. It's not going to be for the duration of the entire importing. And so that's one cheap and easy way that you're able to kind of mitigate this. And the easiest way to do that is with another background job. And so in my case, I'm going to first basically force the encoding, because this spreadsheet that I have, it does have some non-ASCII characters, and I want to force that encoding. So you may not need to do this on your side. I'm going to set a encoded data is equal to the data.force_encoding, and I want to force it to the ASCII, and we'll do 8-bit. We'll encode to the UTF-8, and then we can take in some situations. If it is invalid, then we can replace. If it's undefined, we can replace, and then we can replace it with, we can do anything here. We can do a question mark or something else, but that really doesn't matter too much for this episode. The main bit is now we have some encoded data that we're able to work with, and I am going to need CSV on here, so I'll require the CSV, and then we can call the CSV.parse. We're not having to specify a file or download the file, because the blob download is going to take the contents of that whole chunk. So we have our encoded data that we're going to do the CSV parsing on. And for this particular file, it does have headers. So I'll set the headers is equal to true. We'll create a block, and it's basically iterating through each individual row. So we can call the countries, and then we can create the record job. So that's another background job that we'll need to create, and we can do that simply with the Rails generate job, and we can do it with the countries : create job, and that's going to do the same thing as doing the countries / and then the name of whatever our job is. Either one would work. And so for this job, we can perform later. So it's going to happen in the background again, and we need to pass in a few different things. So I'm going to have a name, and that's going to be row, and then the country, because that is the first header. And then we have a flag URL that we need to download that flag, and that's going to be from the row, and then this was called the flag space URL, all capitalized. And so once this is done, assuming that we've gotten all of our data out of there were no errors, then the problem here is that we still have this blob. We don't need it anymore. It's just taking up a record and also some storage. So at the perform, I'm going to have an ensure. And this is basically where we can then call the blob, and we'll then do a purge _ later. And that will then clear it out, deleting that file from S3 or wherever we have it stored. And it's also going to delete that active storage blob record. So then in our countries create record job, we can change our perform params, where we have a name, and then we also have the flag _URL. And again, those just came from the import job where we are using the keyword arguments here. So we need to pass those in as well. And we can basically now call our country is equal to the country.find or, and I'm going to do an initialize by, and we just want to initialize by the name, and we'll look it up by the name. We can then call the country.flag attach, and this is going to be a little bit different because we don't have a file that we need to import, but instead it is a URL. So we can call the IO and then the URI.open and then the flag _URL. This does mean that we will need to require the open-URI. And probably what I would do is put this in the application.rb, similar for the require CSV, just because I don't want to have this being executed every single time the background job is called, especially on the create record job, because this could get called several hundred times. But I'll leave that for now. And then we also need to give it a file name. That file name we can get with the file.basename of our URI.parse of our flag underscore URL, and we can get the path. And that should get the file name. Oh, and instead of a period there, we do need the open parentheses, and then we need to close that out. And afterwards, we can then call the country.save with the bang, just so it'll raise any errors if there was a problem. And so that's really all we have to do. I really like this approach because we're not having to rely on any external gems like Sidekick Batch, which does have its own benefits and it does different things. And it would probably be very helpful if we needed to keep an interactive track of each one of the records being imported for a particular file upload. But in our case, we're keeping it a bit more simple. But the important part is, for each row, we are creating a new background job, which will help break it up, making this main import job our biggest one that then queues up several hundred or even thousand smaller jobs. And so we can go ahead and boot up our Rails application. We'll come back to the home page. We'll go to import. We can choose a file, which I had that same file that I used in the demo. We'll import it, and then it'll go through importing it, processing all the records. If we look at the terminal, it's definitely doing a lot of different things, and there are a few errors, and I have a guess that these are probably a deadlock, but it's kind of hard to see here. So if we came under our log and the development, in this particular case, it's because we had so many different background jobs, it couldn't obtain a connection from the pool. So in this case, we would have to bump up our pool or have more background workers. But you can see that it's queuing up all of these to run. And the redirect also gave us that same error. And that's where you would want to introduce a proper background worker like SolidQueue, Sidekick, or something similar. And so what I want to do is just go ahead and run the bundle add solid_queue. And because SolidQueue is going to be within Rails 8 as a default, it makes sense to go ahead and become familiar with it now. And then we can call the Rails generate solid_queue:install. That'll create our configuration for the SolidQueue and also copy over the migrations. And in the production.rb, we also got the config active job queue adapter set to SolidQueue. We can go ahead and in our development environment, add that in as well. Or if we wanted to just be a global thing, we can add that to the application.rb. So then all of our environments will use SolidQueue. We can go ahead and run the Rails DB migrate to migrate our database. And off camera, I did go ahead and wipe out all of the countries so we can start fresh. So we can go ahead and run the bin dev to start up our Rails application. And I'm going to create another terminal because we also need to call the bundle exec and then rake solid_queue:start to start up our background worker. And again, you could use Sidekick or Good Job or any other background worker for this. I'm just using SolidQueue because that's what's going to be provided in Rails 8 by default. So we can come back to our homepage. We can import in our countries. I'm going to select our file and we'll import in. And now it just took us immediately to the show page. It didn't error out. If we were to look within our background worker, we did get a few errors where the database is locked, and that's kind of expected here. Really, I don't think that SQLite is the best choice if we need a bunch of background jobs happening at the same time. And really, one thing that we can do to just kind of get through this is we can set our threads to 1, so there's really only one worker that's going to be handling the jobs. We can then restart SolidQueue in our Rails application. I'm going to go ahead and just drop the database just so we start fresh. And then we'll do the bin Rails DB migrate to start that up again. And the bin dev to start up our Rails application. And we'll start up SolidQueue as well. So now, refreshing, we have no countries. We can then import in our countries. I'll drag in the file. We'll upload it. It's being imported. We'll then see the SolidQueue is going to start picking up the jobs. We're not getting any errors now, which is good. We can come back, refresh this, and now we're getting all of our countries coming in really fast. And we have a lot of our active storage attachments. So finally, instead of just showing this active storage attachment, I want to actually display the flag. So in our index, instead of just showing this flag, I want to do an image_tag with our country flag, and we're going to do a variant on it. And we're just going to resize to limit, and then we need to pass in an array, and I'll just make it a 30 by 30. And I only want to do this if the country flag is attached, and I also want to check and make sure that the country flag is an image. You could use representable, but I find that image is pretty much safe to use as well. We can come back, we'll refresh the page, and it'll take a moment because now it's having to then process and upload all of those flags. And I don't have any pagination on here, so it is taking it a while because it's going to have to load in all of these. But you can see some of them are already coming in and it works. And so that's just one of the things when you're dealing with a lot of data, and especially having to deal with many background jobs that are having to do some pretty heavy lifting. This approach isn't necessarily the best solution for all use cases, so you'll want to make sure that you're testing and making sure that you are taking the best approach for your application. Well, that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. For more videos, check out driftandruby.com.